a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such. And yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
New tariffs announced last month are now in effect. They include a global tariff on 10% of all softwood lumber and timber entering the U.S.
Fundamentally, what we need to do is we need to buy more Canadian. We need to help our workers in the sector. We need to be there for the softwood lumber industry, and a company like here today is showing that's the case.
A new home in America costs more than it did last year, not because of interest rates, not because of inflation, because of a decision made at the border. Trump slapped tariffs on Canadian lumber. Rates climbed past 35%. Builders felt it immediately.
Quick answer, no. Doesn't seem like it. It doesn't seem like the Americans want to talk about softwood lumber and the fact that these duties and tariffs are not only hurting workers here in Canada, but more importantly for Americans. It's leading to them not being able to build the homes they need. Just ask the U.S. home builders what this means for them.
And now that cost is sitting inside every new house being built in America. The question isn't whether home buyers are paying for it. They already are. In late 2025 and into 2026, the US layered multiple trade barriers onto Canadian softwood lumber. First came anti-dumping duties, then countervailing duties, then a 10% national security tariff under Section 232. Stack them together and total effective rates pushed past 35%. In some cases they approached 45% depending on the producer and product classification.
The lumber mills on Mitchell Island along the Fraser River are still bustling, but there are worries that they could be in trouble. So last Friday, the U.S. Commerce Department announced a big hike on duties for Canadian softwood lumber.
This wasn't a single clean policy decision. It was an escalation, and it was sold to the American public as protection. Protection for domestic workers, protection for American mills, protection for the industry. But protection from what, exactly? Canada has been America's lumber supplier for decades. Cutting that off doesn't create independence, it creates a problem. Here's what the numbers actually show. The US consumes enormous volumes of softwood lumber every year. Roughly 30% of that demand comes from imports. Canada supplies between 70 and 85% of that imported share depending on the year. That means Canadian lumber isn't a convenience, it's a structural dependency.
We want a long-term softwood lumber deal. We need the federal government to prioritize softwood. For us in British Columbia, softwood is our auto sector, it's our steel sector, and sometimes we feel a bit left out.
And tariffs don't eliminate a structural dependency, they just make it more expensive. The National Association of Home Builders has been clear on this. A 1% increase in lumber prices adds over $1,000 to the cost of an average new home. During peak tariff pressure periods, lumber prices climbed towards $700 to $750 per thousand board feet. That translated into more than $10,000 in additional construction costs per home. That number doesn't stay in a spreadsheet. It moves into the mortgage. It moves into the monthly payment. It moves into the list of people who can no longer afford to buy. So why can't the US just replace Canadian lumber with its own production? Because it isn't that simple. American sawmills were already running near full capacity before the tariffs hit. Labour shortages weren't solvable overnight. Infrastructure was aging. Environmental regulations limited expansion. And building a new mill doesn't happen in months. It takes years, sometimes decades. The capital required runs into the billions. Meanwhile, demand doesn't wait. This structural gap has been decades in the making. The softwood lumber agreement between the US and Canada expired in 2015. It was never replaced. Since then, both countries have been locked in a cycle of tariffs, legal challenges, and countermeasures. By early 2026, Canadian producers had paid roughly $7.7 billion in cumulative duties since 2017. That's not a trade dispute, that's a war of attrition. And it's one that American homebuyers have been quietly funding through higher prices every single time they sign a purchase agreement. The consequences landed fast. In Texas, Florida, and Ohio, builders found themselves caught between rising material costs and budgets locked in months earlier. Projects were delayed, some were redesigned, others were cancelled outright. Higher construction costs didn't stop at new homes either. They fed into rent prices, into renovation expenses, into public infrastructure budgets. The ripple moved outward and kept moving. The job boom that tariff supporters promised never arrived. Protection alone couldn't overcome outdated equipment, higher operating costs, and limited access to affordable timber. Canada's Crown land system gives provincial governments control over vast forest areas. Stumpage fees are set low by design. American producers simply cannot compete with that cost structure. No tariff changes that reality. What the tariff did change was the price tag, and American families are the ones holding it. Here's what nobody expected. Canada didn't fight back the way anyone predicted. It didn't match tariff for tariff on lumber. It did something more damaging. It found new customers. For decades, the US absorbed close to 90% of Canadian lumber exports. That dependency ran both ways. But when tariffs hit, Canadian producers stopped waiting for Washington to change its mind. They started calling Tokyo, Seoul, Amsterdam, Vietnam, India, markets across the Middle East and North Africa. Japan alone increased its imports of Canadian lumber by roughly 25 to 26% during certain periods. Ports in Vancouver and Prince Rupert expanded to handle the new volume. Companies like West Fraser, Canfor and Interfor took the revenue from higher tariff-era prices and reinvested it. New mills, better technology, higher value products. By 2025, Canadian lumber exports outside the United States had grown by nearly 20%. The tariffs designed to weaken Canada's position quietly gave Canadian producers exactly the pressure they needed to stop depending on a single buyer. Step back and look at what actually happened. The US imposed tariffs to build independence from Canada. The outcome was the opposite. Reliance didn't disappear. It became more expensive and less predictable. Canada used the pressure to modernize. It moved up the value chain into engineered wood and cross-laminated timber. It aligned itself with global demand for low-carbon building materials. It became more competitive internationally at the exact moment global buyers were looking for sustainable suppliers. The measures designed to limit Canada's influence amplified it. Higher prices funded the very investments that made Canadian producers stronger, and the US was left with a more fragmented supply chain, higher costs, and no realistic path to domestic self-sufficiency within any political timeline that matters. The cost of independence turned out to be significantly higher than the cost of cooperation ever was. That calculation is now embedded in every new home price in America. This was never just about lumber. It was about what happens when policy ignores supply chain reality. The US needs Canadian lumber. The data settled that question. What's still open is what comes next. Does the tariff strategy continue? Does a new agreement get negotiated? And for Canada, can this diversification momentum hold? Can it fully transition from being America's regional supplier to becoming a global leader in sustainable construction materials? Those questions don't have clean answers yet. What does have an answer is the price of a new home. It went up. A family somewhere in Texas or Florida or Ohio is paying more for a house than they should be. They didn't get a vote on the tariff. They're paying for it anyway.